Oh, hello there. Welcome to lesson one for Intro to Psychology. Today we're going to be why is psychology considered a science? So, if we look at what the learning objectives are for this video, by the end of it, you should be able to explain how psychology is a science if you believe it is. Although we'll talk more about that in the next lesson, we will also describe three key elements of a scientific attitude. And then finally, we're going to talk about how critical thinking feeds that attitude and the importance of that in your life. So let's jump right in. So, what is critical thinking? I want you to go ahead and think about when you think about someone who is a scientist or they have a scientific attitude, what are some things that you notice about how they think? So, go ahead and pause the video, and in your notes, I want you to indicate what you think are three key characteristics to critical thinking or to having a scientific attitude. So pause the video, write down what you think is important. So welcome back. There are three attitudes that we're going to talk about. The first one is curiosity. It's very important to have curiosity throughout your life. Like you never stop learning, ever. You need to have skepticism. And we're going to talk about the difference between skepticism and cynicism because there is a difference. And then finally, humility. And I would argue that this is probably one of the more important ones of the three because if you can't admit to what you don't know, that is dangerous. So let's jump in and look at each of these three. So we're going to start with curiosity. And if I were to define it, I would say it's a passion to explore and to understand. And some people will say it's to find truth. Some people will say it's to do the exploration without being misled. But to me, it's just, you know it when you see it, right? You learn about something and you're like, wow, I really want to understand this better, or I want to know more about this. That is curiosity, and it's a very important skill to have as a scientist and as a critical thinker. So always ask yourself, can you test that theory? So I want you to think about some ideas you've had and have you gone any further in it, right? So here are some examples of some curious things that people have looked at. Can people read other people's minds? So ESP, right? Extrasensory perception. If I were to think about a shape, what shape am I thinking? I dare you to write it down on your sheet, and then we'll see if you got it, because I am thinking of a shape. So you may believe, yes, you can read people's mind, or no, you can't read people's minds, but have you tested it? And I will tell you that no one has yet been able to demonstrate the ability to read people's minds. Bummer. Although sometimes I don't think it's a bad thing that we can't read people's minds. There's also, maybe you're thinking, is stress related to health? And absolutely, we have tested that through scientific studies and experiments that yes, there is a correlation and a causation effect between high levels of stress or chronic stress and health. So curiosity is definitely important, right? We got to think about the fact that in psychology, a lot of people will say, or a lot of times you'll read about studies and you'll be like, oh my gosh, well, duh, why are they testing that? But I want you to think about this question. For years, grandmothers would say, you're going to catch a cold if you're not dressed warmly. And, maybe that's common sense, right? But the truth is we now know that colds are caused by a rhinovirus. That's the name of the virus. And they actually don't live as long in cold weather. So how do you test that? Right? I want you to really think about the fact that is there a correlation between not dressing well for cold weather and then getting sick? So think about that for a little bit. Okay, next is skepticism. So if you remember, I talked about how there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism and being cynical. And I think it's important to note this difference, all right? A cynic is basically going to say, they're disbelievers. They're like, nope, that's not going to work. Here's why. Whereas somebody who is skeptical will say, well, I don't know, that doesn't really fit in my schema. Like, I don't know if I believe that, but let's look into it, okay? So there is a difference. And if you look at kind of how it is on a scale, skeptics are in the middle. Okay, so they're looking at things like, well, that could be true, but I need to research it a little bit more. Over to the far right, you have trailblazers, people who are like, this is absolutely true, and I'm going to make it happen. And that's not always a good way to be. I know trailblazer sounds like a great thing, but then also there's cynics on the other side who are like, nope, that will not work. So think about where you want to be on that scale. Whenever you have a belief or a theory or a hypothesis, it's very important to try and find the weakness in your theory. Try to disprove it. See if you can find data or some research that has been done that shows something different than what you believe. Because I truly believe 100% that beliefs become stronger the more they are tested. And the more you can test it, the more data you can get on your hypothesis, the better. And if you look at this, okay, you got to think about fantasy versus reality. And so there's a belief that your facial expression and your body posture will actually change your mood. And true, believe it or not, that is true. You've probably seen the YouTube video, or I think it was a TED Talk video about, standing with power, and how if you stand a certain way, you exude power, and it changes your brain chemistry, actually. Another question that has come up in psychology is, do parental behaviors determine their children's sexual orientation or not? Again, that's one of those duh questions, right? There has actually been, through research, no relationship between parental behaviors and how they parent and a children's sexual orientation. So understand that skepticism is very important in science, because it's what drives us to think a little bit deeper. Humility. Like I said, I believe that humility is probably one of the most important of the three. This is the willingness to admit that you don't know something, or that your thoughts maybe were incorrect. And being wrong still moves our knowledge forward. I don't want you to think that being wrong is a bad thing. And so we have this saying in psychology or in science that the rat is always right. And what this has to do with is, you may have a belief on behavior, but if the rat behaves differently than what you thought in your experiment, well, you better start changing the way you're thinking, because the rat is always right. The rat is doing what the behavior is. And no matter what your belief is, you have to be willing to be open to the new ideas. I love this quote from Carl Sagan, one of my favorite scientists. In science, it often happens that a scientist says, that's a really good argument. My position is mistaken. And I think when we lose the ability to be humble and to have humility, that is when we start to lose our ability to be critical thinkers. So keep that in mind. All right. Why is critical thinking important? I want you to go ahead and pause, and in your notebook, just write why you think critical thinking or having a scientific attitude is important in today's world. Just pause, write that down, and come on back. Okay, so hopefully you came up with some good ideas to share in class. In summary, we went over, we're going to go over this next class or next lesson, but why is psychology a science or not a science? We're going to talk about that in the next lesson. The three key elements of scientific attitude are curiosity, skepticism, and humility. And then finally, you wrote in your notes about why it's important to have that scientific attitude or critical thinking skills. So that's it for this lesson, you guys. Thanks, and have a great day.